Hey freshmen, Mulaney here, coming to you with a new microphone. I have heard your complaints about the previous recording's sound quality, so hopefully this is a little more consistent and crystal clear, fewer pops and loud sounds. In this video, I'm going to go through Roman numeral 4 of this unit's notes, and then in the next video, I'll go through Roman numeral 5. So, two parts here. Roman numeral 4, Scripture has layers. So let's get into it. Layers like an onion. Every passage of Scripture has different layers of meaning. These are what are known as the two senses of Scripture. There's the literal sense and the spiritual sense. So, yeah, when it says literal meaning, when it says literal meaning, it doesn't mean that it literally happened. The literal sense is really just the basic meaning of the words on the page. Regardless of whether or not they happened, there's a literal meaning. So for instance, here's a sentence with no literal sense whatsoever. Lamppost, fire truck, purple monkey dishwasher. Yeah, it makes no sense, right? It's just words. That's what happens when there's no literal sense. It's like reading comprehension level is where the literal sense matters. And once again, it doesn't mean that it literally happened. It just means the basic meaning. That's the literal sense. Then there's the spiritual sense, and this is where it gets fun. The spiritual sense is the deeper significance of the words in relation to all divine revelation. So this is where you get the more symbolic, interconnected, layered meanings. And there are three flavors of spiritual meaning or spiritual sense. The first is allegorical. The second, moral. The third, anagogical. So, allegorical, that's the meaning connected to Jesus. This is the Christological meaning, is what the textbook calls it. So, even passages in the Old Testament, there's like a secret Jesus connection to every passage of Scripture. That's the allegorical sense. The moral sense, this is the meaning connected to right and wrong. Even more broadly than that, it's like the sense of what does it mean for us today? What does it tell us about how to live? That's the moral sense. So what does it tell us about life today? And then the third one is anagogical. So it's not analogical, it's anagogical. This means that it's directed towards the future, towards eternity. What is this passage telling us about the church in heaven, in our eternal homeland? So what is this telling us about how things are going to be in heaven? So yeah, allegorical, moral, anagogical. Every passage of Scripture has a literal sense, and every passage has all three flavors of spiritual sense. So here's an example. You do not need to write this down. I'm going to give you an example from a well-known story of Scripture, and then so I'll read this, and then I'll give you examples of all the different senses that are happening in this one passage. So, from Genesis. Pairs of all creatures in which there was the breath of life came to Noah into the ark. Those that entered were male and female. Of all creatures that came, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. The flood continued upon the earth for 40 days. As the waters increased, they lifted the ark so that it rose above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, but the ark floated on the surface of the waters. Higher and higher on the earth the waters swelled, until all the highest mountains under the heavens were submerged. The waters swelled 15 cubits higher than the submerged mountains. All creatures that moved on earth perished, birds, tame animals, wild animals, and all that teemed on the earth, as well as all humankind. Everything on dry land with the breath of life in its nostrils died. The Lord wiped out every being on earth. Human beings and animals, the crawling things and the birds of the air, all were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark were left. All right. well-known story or well-known passage from a well-known story. Noah and the ark, right? So, yeah, we got multiple senses here. We got the literal sense, the moral, allegorical, and anagogical. So, the literal sense of these words. Remember, we're not saying whether or not there was a flood. We're not saying whether or not there was a literal ark. All we're saying is what happened in these words. What did these words say happened? And the literal sense here would be animals of both sexes went into a boat with Noah. Then a giant flood came. Water covered everything, but the ark remained afloat. Everything on earth died except for what had been saved in the ark with Noah. You don't need to write these down, by the way. It's just an example. Yeah, the literal sense of this passage is, here's what it says. So, whether or not it happened in history, that's a separate question. Literal sense is just what happened according to these words. The moral sense. We could say here, like, what does this passage tell us about today, life today? Right and wrong, good and evil. We could say that in this passage we see the waters destroyed the bad and lifted the good. So it destroyed all the bad creation, humankind, and it lifted up the good creation. Just like baptism expels evil and gives grace to live a new life of freedom. See how that works? So, yeah, that's the moral sense. Allegorical. This is the meaning connected to Jesus. Where was Jesus in this passage? You might have missed him, but turns out Noah is like Christ, and Christ is the new Noah, saving us from the floodwaters of sin and death. So, just like Noah saved creation from the flood, Christ saves us from sin and death. Then the last one, anagogical meaning. Where's the church in this? And the church was the boat all along, the ark. The ark is Christ's church, which saves creation in this life, preserves it for the new creation at the end of time. So, if you're a part of the church, you're on the ark. And if you're on the ark, you're trying to bring everyone else onto the ark. That's the anagogical meaning. So notice all of these meanings were happening, all these senses were happening at the same time in the same passage. That's how it is with literally every page of Scripture. And it gets to be pretty fun. If we were doing this in class, I would have you name me a random book, chapter, verse, and we could unpack it together to see all the different senses of Scripture happening in that passage. As it is, this is recorded. This example with Noah and the ark will have to do. All right. Letter B, contextualist versus fundamentalist. So these are the two ways to approach Scripture. One is good and one is bad. The contextualist approach says, in order to interpret Scripture, we need to take everything into account. Not just the passage in front of us, but also what do we know from history about this time period? Any science that might touch on this subject? What about the literary genre? What's the genre of this book that we're trying to interpret? Any archaeology that might help us out? What do we know about the culture of the Israelites or the surrounding cultures? What other books of Scripture reference the story? All of those things have to go into account, be taken into account in the contextualist approach. The fundamentalist approach is the bad one. Fundamentalists say that the literal meaning is the only meaning. So the literal sense is the only sense according to the fundamentalist reading of Scripture. And so if it says that it happened, it happened. This would be taking every page of the Bible literally. It's also known as literalism. And yeah, this is not the Catholic way to interpret Scripture. It's, there are versions of Christianity that approach Scripture fundamentalistically. They are fundamentalist churches, and they are mainly like Protestant denominations, often in the American South, but not limited to that. So, the contextualist approach is the Catholic Church-approved method to interpreting Scripture. So, that is Roman numeral 4, and I will stop this video and start a new one for Roman numeral 5, Scripture Overview. Until then.